The French and Indian War was the North American theater of the worldwide 7 Years' War. The war was fought between the colonies of British America and New France, with both sides supported by military units from their parent countries of Great Britain and France, as well as Native American allies. At the start of the war, the French North American colonies had a population of roughly 60,000 European settlers, compared with 2 million in the British North American colonies. The outnumbered French particularly depended on the Indians. Long in conflict, the metropole nations declared war on each other in 1756, escalating the war from a regional affair into an intercontinental conflict. The name French and Indian War is used mainly in the United States and refers to the two main enemies of the British colonists, the Royal French forces and the various indigenous forces allied with them. British and European historians use the term the 7 Years' War, as do English-speaking Canadians. French Canadians call it la guerre de la conquête, or the Fourth Intercolonial War. It began with a dispute over control of the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, called the Forks of the Ohio, and the site of the French Fort Duquesne and present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The dispute erupted into violence in the Battle of Jumonville Glen in May 1754, during which Virginia militiamen under the command of 22-year-old George Washington ambushed a French patrol. In 1755, 6 colonial governors in North America met with General Edward Braddock, the newly arrived British Army commander, and planned a four-way attack on the French. None succeeded and the main effort by Braddock was a disaster. He was defeated in the Battle of the Monongahela on July 9, 1755 and died a few days later. British operations in 1755, 1756 and 1757 in the frontier areas of Pennsylvania and New York all failed, due to a combination of poor management, internal divisions, and effective Canadian scouts, French regular forces, and Indian warrior allies. In 1755, the British captured Fort Beauséjour on the border separating Nova Scotia from Acadia. Soon afterward they ordered the expulsion of the Acadians. Orders for the deportation were given by William Shirley, Commander-in-Chief, North America, without direction from Great Britain. The Acadians, both those captured in arms and those who had sworn the loyalty oath to His Britannic Majesty, were expelled. Native Americans were likewise driven off their land to make way for settlers from New England. After the disastrous 1757 British campaigns, the British government fell. William Pitt came to power and significantly increased British military resources in the colonies at a time when France was unwilling to risk large convoys to aid the limited forces it had in New France. France concentrated its forces against Prussia and its allies in the European theatre of the war. Between 1758 and 1760, the British military launched a campaign to capture the colony of Canada. They succeeded in capturing territory and surrounding colonies and ultimately Quebec. Though the British were later defeated at Saint Foy in Quebec, the French ceded Canada in accordance with the 1763 treaty. The outcome was one of the most significant developments in a century of Anglo-French conflict. France ceded its territory east of the Mississippi to Great Britain. It ceded French Louisiana west of the Mississippi River to its ally Spain, in compensation for Spain's loss to Britain of Florida. France's colonial presence north of the Caribbean was reduced to the islands of Saint Pierre and Miquelon, confirming Britain's position as the dominant colonial power in eastern North America. The origin of the name. The conflict is known by multiple names. In British America, wars were often named after the sitting British monarch, such as King William's War or Queen Anne's War. As there had already been a King George's War in the 1740s, British colonists named the Second War in King George's reign after their opponents, and it became known as the French and Indian War. This traditional name continues as the standard in the United States, but it obscures the fact that Indians fought on both sides of the conflict. and that this was part of the 7 Years' War, a much larger conflict between France and Great Britain. American historians generally use the traditional name or sometimes the 7 Years' War. Other, less frequently used names for the war include the Fourth Intercolonial War and the Great War for the Empire. In Europe, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War usually is not given a separate name. The entire international conflict is known as the 7 Years' War. 7 years refers to events in Europe, from the official declaration of war in 1756 to the signing of the peace treaty in 1763. These dates do not correspond with the fighting on mainland North America, where the fighting between the two colonial powers was largely concluded in 6 years. From the Battle of Jumonville Glen in 1754 to the capture of Montreal in 1760. In Canada, both French-speaking and English-speaking Canadians refer to both the European and North American conflicts as the 7 Years' War. French Canadians also use the term War of Conquest, since it is the war in which Canada was conquered by the British and became part of the British Empire. North America in the 1750s. At this time, North America east of the Mississippi River was largely claimed by either Great Britain or France. Large areas had no settlements by Europeans. The French population numbered about 75,000 and was heavily concentrated along the St. Lawrence River Valley, with some also in Acadia. Few lived in New Orleans, Biloxi, Mississippi, Mobile, Alabama, and small settlements in the Illinois country, hugging the east side of the Mississippi River and its tributaries. French fur traders and trappers traveled throughout the St. Lawrence and Mississippi watersheds, did business with local tribes, and often married Indian women. Traders married daughters of chiefs, creating high-ranking unions. British settlers outnumbered the French 20-1 with a population of about 1.5 million ranged along the eastern coast of the continent, from Nova Scotia and Newfoundland in the north, to Georgia in the south. Many of the older colonies had land claims that extended arbitrarily far to the west. As the extent of the continent was unknown at the time their provincial charters were granted. While their population centers were along the coast, the settlements were growing into the interior. Nova Scotia, which had been captured from France in 1713, still had a significant French-speaking population. Britain also claimed Rupert's Land, where the Hudson's Bay Company traded for furs with local tribes. In between the French and the British, large areas were dominated by native tribes. To the north, the Mi'kmaq and the Abenaki were engaged in Father Le Louter's War and still held sway in parts of Nova Scotia, Acadia, and the eastern portions of the province of Canada, as well as much of present-day Maine. The Iroquois Confederation dominated much of present-day upstate New York and the Ohio country, although the latter also included Algonquin-speaking populations of Delaware and Shawnee, as well as Iroquoian-speaking Mingo. These tribes were formerly under Iroquois rule, and were limited by them in authority to make agreements. Further south, the southeast interior was dominated by Siouan-speaking Catawba, Muskogee-speaking Creek and Choctaw, and the Iroquoian-speaking Cherokee tribes. When war broke out, the French used their trading connections to recruit fighters from tribes in western portions of the Great Lakes region, including the Huron, Mississauga, Ojibwa, Winnebago, and Potawatomi. The British were supported in the war by the Iroquois Six Nations, and also by the Cherokee, until differences sparked the Anglo Cherokee War in 1758. In 1758, the Pennsylvania government successfully negotiated the Treaty of Easton, in which a number of tribes in the Ohio country promised neutrality in exchange for land concessions and other considerations. Most of the other northern tribes sided with the French, the primary trading partner and supplier of arms. The Creek and Cherokee were subject to diplomatic efforts by both the French and British to gain either their support or neutrality in the conflict. It was not uncommon for small bands to participate on the other side of the conflict from formally negotiated agreements. As most tribes were decentralized and bands made their own decisions about warfare. By this time, in eastern North America, Spain claimed only the province of Florida. It controlled Cuba and other territories in the West Indies that became military objectives in the 7 Years' War. Florida's European population was a few hundred, concentrated in St. Augustine and Pensacola. At the start of the war, no French regular army troops were stationed in North America, and few British troops. New France was defended by about 3,000 troops de la marine, companies of colonial regulars. The colonial government recruited militia support when needed. Most British colonies mustered local militia companies, generally ill-trained and available only for short periods, to deal with native threats, but did not have any standing forces. Because of its large frontier, Virginia had several companies of British regulars. The colonial governments were used to operating independently of each other and of the government in London, a situation that complicated negotiations with native tribes. Their territories often encompassed land claimed by multiple colonies. After the war began, the leaders of the British Army establishment tried to impose constraints and demands on the colonial administrations. Events leading to war. Saint Laurent's expedition in June 1747. Concerned about the incursion and expanding influence of British traders such as George Croghan in the Ohio country, Roland Michel Baron de la Galissonière, the Governor-General of New France, ordered Pierre-Joseph Saint Laurent to lead a military expedition through the area. Its objectives were to confirm the original French claim to the territory, determine the level of British influence, and impress the Indians with a French show of force. Saint Laurent's expedition force consisted of about 200 troops de la marine and 30 Indians. The expedition covered about 3,000 miles between June and November 1749. It went up the St. Lawrence, continued along the northern shore of Lake Ontario, crossed the portage at Niagara, and followed the southern shore of Lake Erie. At the Chautauqua Portage, the expedition moved inland to the Allegheny River, which it followed to the site of present-day Pittsburgh. There Saint Laurent buried lead plates engraved with the French claim to the Ohio country. Whenever he encountered British merchants or fur traders, Saint Laurent informed them of the French claims on the territory, and told them to leave. When Saint Laurent's expedition arrived at Logstown, the Native Americans in the area informed Saint Laurent that they owned the Ohio country and that they would trade with the British regardless of the French. Saint Laurent continued south until his expedition reached the confluence of the Ohio and the Miami rivers, which lay just south of the village of Pickawillany, the home of the Miami chief known as Old Britain. Saint Laurent threatened Old Britain with severe consequences if he continued to trade with the British. Old Britain ignored the warning. Disappointed, Saint Laurent returned to Montreal in November 1749. In his extensively detailed report, Saint Laurent wrote, "All I can say is that the natives of these localities are very badly disposed towards the French, and are entirely devoted to the English. I don't know in what way they could be brought back." Even before his return to Montreal, reports on the situation in the Ohio country were making their way to London and Paris, each side proposing that action be taken. William Shirley, the expansionist governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay, was particularly forceful, stating that British colonists would not be safe as long as the French were present. Conflicts between the colonies, accomplished through raiding parties that included Indian allies, had taken place for decades, leading to a brisk trade in European colonial captives from either side. Negotiations in 1749. The British government gave land to the Ohio Company of Virginia for the purpose of developing trade and settlements in the Ohio country. The grant required that it settle 100 families in the territory, and construct a fort for their protection. But, as the territory was also claimed by Pennsylvania, both colonies began pushing for action to improve their respective claims. In 1750, Christopher Gist, acting on behalf of both Virginia and the Company, explored the Ohio Territory and opened negotiations with the Indian tribes at Logstown. He completed the 1752 Treaty of Logstown, in which the local Indians, through their half-king, Tanacharison, and an Iroquois representative, agreed to terms that included permission to build a strong house at the mouth of the Monongahela River. By the late 17th century, the Iroquois had pushed many tribes out of the Ohio Valley, and kept it as hunting ground by right of conquest. The War of the Austrian Succession formally ended in 1748 with the signing of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. The treaty was primarily focused on resolving issues in Europe. The issues of conflicting territorial claims between British and French colonies in North America were turned over to a commission to resolve, but it reached no decision. Frontiers from between Nova Scotia and Acadia in the north, to the Ohio Country in the south were claimed by both sides. The disputes also extended into the Atlantic Ocean, where both powers wanted access to the rich fisheries of the Grand Banks off Newfoundland. Attack on Pickawillany. On March 17, 1752, the Governor-General of New France, Marquis de la Jonquière, died and was temporarily replaced by Charles Le Moyne de Longueuil. His permanent replacement, the Marquis Duquesne, did not arrive in New France until 1752 to take over the post. The continuing British activity in the Ohio territories prompted Longueuil to dispatch another expedition to the area under the command of Charles Michel de Langlade, an officer in the troops de la Marine. Langlade was given 300 men, including French Canadians and warriors of the Ottawa. His objective was to punish the Miami people of Pickawillany for not following Saint Laurent's orders to cease trading with the British. On June 21, the French war party attacked the trading center at Pickawillany, capturing 3 traders and killing 14 people of the Miami Nation, including Old Britain. He was reportedly ritually cannibalized by some Aboriginal members of the expedition. French fort construction. In the spring of 1753, Paul Marin de la Malgue was given command of a 2,000-man force of troops de la Marine and Indians. His orders were to protect the King's Land in the Ohio Valley from the British. Marin followed the route that Saint Laurent had mapped out 4 years earlier, but where Saint Laurent had limited the record of French claims to the burial of lead plates, Marin constructed and garrisoned forts. He first constructed Fort Presqu'Isle on Lake Erie's south shore. He had a road built to the headwaters of LeBoeuf Creek. Marin constructed a second fort at Fort LeBoeuf, designed to guard the headwaters of LeBoeuf Creek. As he moved south, he drove off or captured British traders, alarming both the British and the Iroquois. Tanacharison, a chief of the Mingo, who were remnants of Iroquois and other tribes who had been driven west by colonial expansion. He intensely disliked the French. Traveling to Fort LeBoeuf, he threatened the French with military action, which Marin contemptuously dismissed. The Iroquois sent runners to the manor of William Johnson in upstate New York, the British superintendent for Indian affairs in the New York region and beyond. Johnson was known to the Iroquois as Warahige, meaning, he who does great things. He spoke their languages and had become a respected honorary member of the Iroquois Confederacy in the area. In 1746, Johnson was made a colonel of the Iroquois. Later he was commissioned as a colonel of the Western New York Militia. They met at Albany, New York with Governor Clinton and officials from some of the other American colonies. Mohawk Chief Hendrick, speaker of their tribal council, insisted that the British abide by their obligations and block French expansion. When Clinton did not respond to his satisfaction, Chief Hendrick said that the covenant chain, a long-standing friendly relationship between the Iroquois Confederacy and the British Crown, was broken. Virginia's response. Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia was an investor in the Ohio Company, which stood to lose money if the French held their claim. To counter the French military presence in Ohio, in October 1753 Dinwiddie ordered the 21-year-old Major George Washington of the Virginia Regiment to warn the French to leave Virginia Territory. Washington left with a small party, picking up along the way Jacob Van Braam as an interpreter, Christopher Gist, a company surveyor working in the area, and a few Mingo led by Tannerisson. On December 12, Washington and his men reached Fort Le Boeuf. Jacques Lugarde de Saint-Pierre, who succeeded Marin as commander of the French forces after the latter died on October 29, invited Washington to dine with him. Over dinner, Washington presented Saint-Pierre with the letter from Dinwiddie demanding an immediate French withdrawal from the Ohio country. Saint-Pierre said, "As to the summons you send me to retire, I do not think myself obliged to obey it." He told Washington that France's claim to the region was superior to that of the British, since René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle had explored the Ohio country nearly a century earlier. Leaving Fort Le Boeuf early on December 16, Washington and his party arrived in Williamsburg on January 16, 1754. In his report, Washington stated, the French had swept south, detailing the steps they had taken to fortify the area, and their intention to fortify the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers.